Hello and welcome to Addis Matters, our weekly show on Ethiopian current affairs with me, Begna Simesso. This is part of our COVID special series where we analyze various impacts of the pandemic, from political economy to social behavior, from religion and education to arts and culture. Today's focus is on the economic impacts of COVID-19. Some call it coronomics. I have two distinguished guests to look deep into the matter. Dr. Constantinos Berhe Tesfa, policy advisor, and Getachew Mariam, a young investment consultant. Both generations, the young and the restless, are represented. Welcome to the show. Thank you for your time, views, and insights.
Thank you.
A lot has been said about the adverse impacts of COVID-19 on global economy, from millions of job losses in many countries to decreased productivity and diminishing transactions. We shall have a deep look at it. I would like to start with you, Constantinos, if I may, with a broader question. You have worked extensively in Africa on more than 25 countries in the continent, and in 2011 TED Talk presentation that you made at Hilton Addis, you've said, with the exception of Mauritius, all African countries are led by failed or failing states, defining failed or failing states as those who are unable or struggling to provide basic developmental and security services to their citizens. And add corona pandemic to this problem, to the wibbly states that we have in Africa. It's like adding salt, so to speak, to the wound. How do you rate the effects of the disease and the ability of the African states to respond to that?
Well, thank you. I think we can update that. It's not only Mauritius. Now we have some countries that are progressing towards democracy. Ghana is one, for example, which has shown very good signs of political development. But one of the most difficult issues is the genesis of the African state. We had colonial powers. After they left, we had leaders who received the power from the colonial powers, and then we had military governments. And now we're coming to the COVID-19 or coronavirus. One of the organizations I'm working in is African Humanitarian Action, which is supporting refugees and internally displaced people in Africa. And we have footprints in 22 countries in Africa. And for this reason, besides my UN career working in different African countries, we still have some latest information. If you see, for example, around the Horn of Africa, Somalia is still in the brink of collapse. South Sudan, we have similar problems. Sudan is emerging from what has been a war in four fronts. Eritrea and Ethiopia are making peace, but the kind of human development activities you see in this place is very, very small. So when it comes to COVID-19, the challenge is Africa still is not affected as much as Europe or North America has been affected. But for one, African countries moved in very quickly to locking down their capital cities, which are the main entry points for the virus from other countries. And the second thing is, of course, the number of testing kits that you have in Africa are very small and challenging. But yet Africa is still good when it comes to this. And in Africa, you cannot do any kind of lockdown because people, they just live for the day. They go to the market, they buy, they sell, and that's how most people live in Africa. So far, we haven't seen any form of lockdowns. On the economic impact, I think those countries that have been exporting minerals and petroleum products are the ones that have been affected, countries like Angola, where it gets 90% of its fiscal revenue from oil. Countries like Nigeria are coping because the oil contribution to the gross domestic product is very, very small. But when we see the African continent today, economically it will be impacted upon because one, foreign direct investment will be very small. Diaspora contribution will be decreasing because the diaspora themselves might be unemployed in the countries where they are living. Tourism has gone down. Air transport has been severely affected, like Ethiopian Airlines contributes about $4 billion to the Ethiopian GDP. So that is gone now. Besides the fact that Ethiopian Airlines now is dependent on the state to be bailed out to the tune of $550 million so far. So when you see these aspects, it has a kind of cascading domino effect on the economy where foreign direct investment, aid, diaspora funds, exports, all these are going to be limited and Africa will be affected by it. So the kind of funds that are being generated now as stimulus package amounting to $9 trillion globally, African countries might get some money from this, but the problem is, are they going to use it wisely? The usual corrupt leaders we have in Africa will be funneling these funds towards other ends instead of building their sustainable health systems. So in Ethiopia, for example, thanks to some earlier visionaries like Dr. Tedros, who was the health minister here, he created what you call these health agents and built about 3,000 clinics around the country. And this has been the basis for the achieving the what you call the Millennium Development Goals of the United Nations in 2015. Of course, we have some problems with maternal mortality and child mortality, but overall Ethiopia has good success in the MDGs. So this can be a base for creating sustainable health systems. Most African countries don't have such health systems that have been in place. Countries like Central African Republic, DRC, is probably the richest country in the world. Its mineral content now is estimated at $34 trillion, which makes it the richest country in the world, even above the United States and China. But because of the conflicts we have, these countries like DRC, Central African Republic, are the ones that provide coltan for transistors, mobile phones, computers. They provide now lithium for electric cars. The kind of natural resources they have in terms of minerals, flora and fauna is so great, they could have been rich countries. But the problem is the problem of governance. It's not necessarily a kind of democratic state that you have to create overnight, but to have benevolent dictatorships who can really run these countries and benefit their own people. Of course, democracy needs cultural change, and it takes generations. In most cases, in Europe, it has taken 400 years, where we see populists now eroding the democratic state. In the US, it has taken 200 years, where we see the current government eroding democratic institutions. So in Africa, what we are looking for is to create a governance system where the government and the people could benefit equally. So with this COVID-19, the biggest challenge I see is the failure of governance systems and state failure, which cannot provide public goods to its citizens.
Thank you. But in spite of that, you said we are okay for now, at least, isn't it? The rates, the numbers, the latest data I have is about 200,000 Africans are infected by the pandemic, and of them about 5,000 people have died of corona pandemic. Getachew, let me come closer to home. Back in March, you've written, before the state of emergency was declared, you've published an article on Addis Standard on the potential economic impacts of COVID-19 in Ethiopia. How do you evaluate the impacts of the pandemic on the country so far?
So I believe pretty much of the things that were mentioned in that particular article that I have written are actually being realized on the ground. In some sectors, the impact of the pandemic has really been very deep and wide-reaching. particularly, for example, in the hospitality and tourism sector, really the impact has really been huge. Pretty much the sector has come to a standstill, literally, and I think partly what is making the thing very complicated and very challenging is also the way the government is responding to the whole process. For example, if you are a hotel operating in Addis, now your rate of occupancy for your rooms is really very low, but and the overall service has come to a standstill. But still, you have to actually maintain your employees in the payroll, while you don't have actually any other support mechanism that could actually complement the resources that you are paying for your employees. Of course, I mean, some credit line has come in the way, but I think that credit line really is very small. It only covers capital investments. It doesn't complement the overheads that you pay as the owner to your employees. So pretty much the overhead cost has to be shouldered by you, while your business has actually come to a standstill. And it's like a gross way of responding that the government is actually following, because the institutions, different hotels have different needs because of their location, because of their size, because of their business model. You can't have a one-size-fits-all kind of response for the whole sector. So partly what is making things difficult is the way the government is responding to the overall process. But generally, I think as a country and as policymakers, this government has kind of started very well, because it kind of started early on in terms of like responding to the pandemic, and in terms of like projecting what possible impact this could have on the economy, on the social sector, as well as on the health and livelihoods of the people. But unfortunately, since the early numbers were really very small, you know, the daily additions or number of cases being identified were very small. I think so because of that low number of confirmed cases daily on the early days, the government kind of have relaxed in the midway, like the way the overall society. Pretty much there seems to be no sector that is not being touched by the impact of this pandemic. And partly, I think, as I see it, the response from the government does not equal to the magnitude of the problem, and is not really dynamic enough, considering the way the pandemic is evolving. Because I believe that generally the policy is largely static in this country for a very long time, since like pretty much we are operating with a policy framework that has been in here since 2004. While the challenge is actually evolving, and the magnitude and the intricacy of things is actually changing by days, we seem to be like responding with a static framework, which is not really helping the overall thing.
Thank you, Getachew. That's very good. You've mentioned some of the sectors. I would like to add on them. A recent report by CFS identified 4 major sectors in Ethiopia that are hugely affected by the pandemic. The hospitality sector, as you mentioned, export, manufacturing, and the banking sector. These are probably the major areas, according to the CFS report, that are hugely affected by the pandemic. Dr. Kosti, you mentioned African countries that are reliant on mineral resources. Unfortunately, we are not that fortunate to have minerals. But on the other hand, I mean, Ethiopians, all the sectors mentioned, the hospitality, the export, the manufacturing, and the banking sectors are urban sectors. But majority of our people are rural, like more than 80% of the country. So having comparing the urban versus the rural economy of our country, how damaging will the effects of the pandemic be to the overall economy of the country?
Well, I think we'll have to look at the structural problems first. Ethiopia's economy has a structural problem. Although it is a free market economy, in principle, we don't have the pillars of free market economy. And whether you call it a revolutionary democracy or developmental state, every state is of course developmental. We see governments now bailing out their business. The United States has put $3 trillion to bail out business. European Union has put $3.5 trillion. G20 has $5 trillion. The IMF, World Bank, a total of $9 trillion have been promised by governments to bail out the global economy. When it comes to our country, most developmental states, whether they are purely developmental as they claim, or like any other state that is developmental, they have three pillars. One is the government, which provides policy, strategy, and financial resource from the revenue it collects or from the aid it gets. And also it builds infrastructure that the private sector would not build, would be very expensive for the private sector. Then the second is the private sector that would be the engine of agricultural and industrial development in our country. The third main player is the academia, which provides the research products in technology, in policy, in strategy, both for the private sector and the government. For example, at Addis University, our PhD and master's students who are producing a lot of dissertations, but there is no way that this could be plowed into policy development in government. So these three pillars are not working together. The second thing is, although it's a free market economy, the financial sector in Ethiopia is closed. Whether you liberalize these big Ethiopian companies or not doesn't really matter as long as the finance sector is closed. Djibouti, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, South Sudan, they have international finance companies, international banks that bring in major resources into the country to drive private sector development. There is no rationale for the Ethiopian government to maintain the finance sector closed only to Ethiopians. It doesn't make any sense. Otherwise, we'll continue to beg all our life and get money as a donation, as loans, which we cannot repay at the end of the day. But if you're going to have a dynamic economy, you need to have these international financial institutions. Among big economies, probably it could be North Korea and Ethiopia that don't have international financial institutions, and of course Eritrea, if you call it a country. But the problem I have is the finance sector itself is in such a dismal state that the COVID-19 impact would be compounded to a very high degree. Recently, all commercial banks didn't have even cash burn. So the problem you have now is exports could be limited, like flour exports, for example, because nobody in Europe would be buying flours at this time when everybody is locked down. Coffee has a problem to export because the price of coffee internationally and the price of coffee locally is so different that there is no incentive for farmers to sell it at international prices. So locally they can sell it for a better money. The hospitality industry is part of what I mentioned, Ethiopian Airlines contribution of 4 billion. It's not just the hotels, but the entire sector and supply chain which brings people into the hotels. Conferences are completely shut down now. In fact, I'm enjoying the Zoom and Skype conference now because you don't have to travel anymore. But the point is, this virus is going to stay with us. It's not going anywhere. And it's important that the Ethiopian government goes into some structural reform of the economy. When we talk about the macroeconomic reform, we're just saying we're going to sell shares in some companies and then that's it. But if you don't have the capital, and also the other pillars of a free market economy are credit and capital markets, which we don't have here.
Yeah. So how do you relate that with the pandemic? I mean, economies that have liberalized markets and, you know, private financial institutions are also hugely affected by it, and they are looking for the state subsidy or a state bailout. So how can we relate that with the current situation? That, I mean, I totally understand your view of, you know, for privatization, but
that's true. But let's compare the countries that have managed the pandemic very well and that have mismanaged the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if you take New Zealand, which has announced yesterday it has cleaned out the virus now from its country.
Mm.
Look at Norway, look at Germany, look at Taiwan. You know, what is interesting is all of them are led by women leaders, by women prime ministers. So these leaders have made it a point that the pandemic does not affect their people and their economy. If you look at, for example, Italy, Spain, Brazil, the United States, it is the irresponsible leadership of state leaders that brought all these problems. It's not the structure of the economy. Of course, the US economy has a shock absorber, and they can afford to put $3 trillion to bail out their economy. But you have over 100,000 people dead already. So when I'm referring to the Ethiopian case, we already have macroeconomic structural problems in this country. We have structural food deficits amounting to 5 to 7 million people every year, even in good rainy seasons. And then we have this pandemic coming, which will result in some kind of economic depression. For example, in the hospitality sector that you mentioned, cafes, restaurants are not selling anything. So I think this is a very serious problem. And in my previous interviews, I have said at the beginning of the pandemic that the government should provide a stimulus package to keep the cafes, restaurants, and small business going. When we talk about SMEs, small and medium enterprises, we're talking about a huge economic contribution from this sector. The United States, people feel that you have 5-6 billionaires that we know their names, Bill Gates and others, but the bulwark of the US economy is based on SMEs. And here also in Ethiopia, the government have said it over and over again to protect this small and medium enterprise, because to start a small and medium enterprise is a very difficult task. Once it's gone, to restart it again is even more difficult. So the pandemic will have an effect on smallholders. The second thing is the banking industry. As I said earlier, frankly, I've never seen any bank in the history of banking providing dividends up to 60-70% in any country, anywhere in the world. It's only in Ethiopia. So it's literally like a Ponzi scheme where you buy shares in a bank and you get your capital in 2-3 years. So this is a very serious concern for our national bank, to come up with a formula where local banks can benefit and international banks can come in to provide more capital. Assume, for example, Gilgal-Libisri Dam or the Renaissance, Grand Renaissance Dam. I don't think all Ethiopian banks combined would have the loan capital to build even one dam. This is the state of our banking system, our financial system, and therefore that has to be changed. On the export side, we've talked about industrial parks in Ethiopia built by the government. We have about 11 of them now. Most of them are not functioning full capacity, I hear. But see the comparison with Kenya. Kenya has 110 industrial parks. All of them are private. They are functioning properly. Their balance of payments are always balanced to some degree. There is no foreign currency shortage in either of the countries I mentioned, be it Djibouti, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania. All of them have functional economies. And I hear the Prime Minister saying that the day before yesterday we could not live on borrowed money and borrowed time. I think he's right. But he needs the support of the public, the support of the academia, the support of the private sector to get this to fruition. Otherwise, the pandemic, frankly, once it goes into the rural sector, I led the Red Cross in the 1984 famine in Ethiopia, where 1 million people died. I was heading the Red Cross operation at that time. And imagine to see 1 million people die. And if this pandemic has any way of going into the rural sector, frankly, it's going to be difficult for this government to bail out its economic institutions.
Yeah. Let's see the human cost of the problem. I mean, still it's, as I said, an urban problem. But according to the Federal Jobs Creation Commission recent statement, there are nearly 1.9 million self-employing businesses in Ethiopian cities. As you mentioned, small and medium or small and micro enterprises. Most are in the informal service sector, such as street vendors. Given the uncertainties of the COVID-19 crisis, the Commission estimates conservatively that around 750,000 jobs could disappear in the next 3 months, most of them in the cities. You have proposed in your earlier discussion that we had, you have proposed expanding the safety net program into the urban areas. The PSNP is very strong in rural Ethiopia, covering more than 8 million people. But in urban areas, it covers only about 600,000 people. Most of them are in Addis, about 1/3 of them, 200,000. The urban poor are covered in the urban safety net program. What is the way out for the urban poor? You can also comment on the working poor, which are people in the informal sector, or we can call them soon to be poor segment of the urban population who are at the risk of going down. What's the way out?
Well, before looking at the way out, I think, as doctors said, we have to see the structural vulnerabilities of the economy generally. I think a major structural vulnerability of the Ethiopian economy comes from its young population. We have close to 70% of our population less than 35 years old. But our economy is still reliant largely on agriculture, even if recently service sector has kind of taken the lead in the economy. But the problem with a lead in the service sector is the absorptive capacity, or the capacity of the sector to actually create jobs for young people is very limited, because it depends on the customer that comes to you. It's with the expanding customer that you can have more employees employed in the sector. So generally, service sector, structurally speaking, has low absorptive capacity in terms of creating jobs. Our agriculture is subsistent largely and has low productivity. So we have huge redundant labor in the agriculture sector. Imagine like 83% of our population is still dependent on agriculture, but we are not feeding ourselves. It means we have a huge redundant labor that's not helping the productivity of the economy. So according to recent government information, we are sitting like on 11 million stock of unemployed people, and we are adding 2 million unemployed people each year. So this shows that even if we have been really growing very fast over the years, that growth that we have been witnessing over the last 16, 17 years has largely been jobless growth, because it's not creating enough jobs for the young population. And the other problem, and our status of human development is really very low. Even if recently we have seen an increment in terms of primary health care coverage, in terms of school enrollment, really in terms of functional literacy, we are not improving. Really, we are still seeing like a functional literacy rates. That means people who are knowledgeable and informed to an extent of their level of education is close to 90% only. So this is really a huge problem. In the health sector, even if in terms of expanding infrastructure, health posts, health stations have been being built, the quality of health service is really very low now. And we are still seeing huge rates of preventive diseases. I mean, diseases that could actually be prevented because if the health system was actually strong enough. And maternal and child mortality is still high. And simple diseases like diarrhea are killing thousands of people in this country. So generally, the Human Development Index in the country is very low. The status of human development of the country is very low. So these basics, and if we take this thing into the economy, you know, we were looking at this dichotomy between the urban and the rural economy. As we have been mentioning, the rural economy sees huge redundant labor that has to be actually taken out of that economy. But the urban economy is not creating those opportunities because it's largely dominated by informal sector. A large population of the urban economy or the urban population of the country is hosted in the informal sector.
So a more inclusive approach is required. So we've seen the problem, I think, in enough depth, I think, from corruption to the structural problems in the financial sectors, in agriculture and the rest. Recovery plans, solutions. Any advices, Getachew? You've talked about the urban safety net program initially. You were just starting about the recovery plan, and I would like to give you the chance to explain that now.
So one thing that the government has to actually do at this point in time is to actually do the diagnostic in a very comprehensive manner. How are we going to see the impact and what's required out of us? So one thing is comprehensive diagnostic. The other thing is you have to have enough monetary and fiscal firepower at your hand. I mean, normally in normal times, you would actually be cautious about important imbalances in the macroeconomy, like, for example, a fiscal deficit, how much of a fiscal deficit or a budget deficit annually you entertain. But during the times of pandemic, you don't have to actually watch your responses against those indicators, because sometimes your response could actually require more resources and your fiscal deficit could actually be higher than the normal times. So we have to get away from this threshold that is imposed on us by international financial institutions and international standards. This is an extraordinary time. We cannot actually live under the banner of those thresholds. We need to have a leeway to actually push those indicators beyond the normal times and allow for more resources to actually fight against the pandemic. And the good part of the response for the government is, until now at least, they actually kind of avoided a complete lockdown of the economy, which means essentially some of the essential economic activities are still going on, which actually paves the way for a smooth recovery. If we were actually in a complete lockdown, recovery would have actually been really tough, challenging, and it's going to be really costly in terms of recovery, in terms of resources, both fiscal as well as monetary resources. So I think now, because basic economic activities are going on now, what we are required is to identify where are the growth potentials, what we can do in the short term to reboot the growth potentials and actually provide the right resources for rebooting the overall economy. But as I see it, and as the numbers are telling, I think the pandemic is going to stay for a longer time than expected. So recovery is going to be really slow, and it's going to take longer. That's going to be really tough because we don't have so much of a buffer resource to actually pay for whatever response activities that we do as a government. So the important element in this is the government has to actually seek more resources from outside sources in the form of concessional aid and loans. And at this point in time, of course, our debt stock is also a problem, because we are also inching closer to 60% of GDP. So we have to actually learn that we are not working under a normal condition. So our debt stock could actually be a little bit higher than this when we are going to be responding. So in the meantime, what we need to also put in place is a right way of actually reducing our debt stock and boosting our repayment capacity. So generally, but of course, in the health side, in the social side, we have to also use institutional mechanisms of response. I think Ethiopia is advantaged in terms of institutional systems to responding to this thing. Well, one thing, we do have huge manpower in the form of health extension workers, agricultural extension workers, and urban safety net workers. So I believe mobilizing an integrated response mechanism using all this manpower would really be very important, because it reduces the kind of cost that we incur as an economy. So I think mobilization of an integrated solution or an integrated systemic mobilization would really be important in this. Maybe a last point on recovery is, I think, one thing we need to correct at this point in time is our assumption about the pandemic. We are not going to be only having a first wave of the pandemic. We might have a second wave, and we might even have a third wave. So much is uncertain. Our policymakers have to actually learn that it is important to have a dynamic framework that adjusts itself to the evolution of the pandemic, and actually all the institutions, including, basically in terms of economic recovery and stimulus package, it's all about the National Bank of Ethiopia and the Ministry of Finance. I think they really have to kind of adopt a dynamic policy making framework so that a response evolves with the pandemic, because so much is uncertain about this thing. But generally, looking things in a very comprehensive manner, having a comprehensive response framework is very important.
Thank you.
We have to avoid a huge crisis.
Thanks so much. We are coming to an end, Dr. Kosti. Let me come to you. Can we put like a sort of, you said that the pandemic could stay with us for quite a while, but there was a CFS report that I mentioned earlier, which assumes a 3 to 6 months recovery period. The government seems to be very optimistic, maybe 3 months, assuming the agriculture sector will not be affected. But as I said earlier, there could be a risk to the agriculture if the import of inputs like fertilizers is delayed. But I would like to hear your advice to the recovery plan.
Number one, now I don't think we can manage this epidemic alone. So we need to have a good negotiating capacity to get the best out of the international aid that's being available now in terms of stimulus, $9 trillion. So not only to protect ourselves from this disease, but to increase our economic sustainability so that we will be able to withstand this kind of shocks and stress in the future. So you need to have a good team. The second thing is we talk about debt relief now. But frankly, the last debt relief under the G8 or G7 under President Obama, we're back in square one. We're still looking for another debt relief now. So the IMF instruments that are providing debt relief are not functional enough. So what are the more creative ways of looking into getting more finance to have to deal with the interlocking structural vulnerabilities we have in this country in the economy? The second thing on the health side is to look into the testing, quarantining people and everything. In fact, the quarantining people at the airport is hurting the economy so much. We have to look into the experience of Austria, where they do the virus checking at the airport. Of course, people pay for it, but here we can see if we can find some support for this. The other thing is this pandemic, if anything can be talked positive about it, it has brought cultural change. People are washing their hands now. They're looking into personal hygiene and sanitation. So this must continue. 80% of disease, according to UNICEF, can be prevented by washing your hands alone, especially communicable diseases. So that must continue. And all political parties, most of them are ethnic parties, unfortunately, but all political parties must galvanize their capacity to marshal their experience to be able to fight this disease and to create a sustainable economic system instead of fighting against each other. We see all this talk about constitutional crisis. I think now we have to focus on sustaining Ethiopia as a nation. The third thing is food security. We have 122 billion cubic meters of water going out of this country every year through our rivers. Ethiopia is called the water tower of Northeast Africa. And we have 72 million hectares of arable land, which we only use less than 20%. Why can't we use it? Even I hear the Prime Minister talking about it. What is the problem? What is the challenge? The challenge is public administration. I have taught in Addis Ababa University 325 master's graduates in public administration. All of them are working for NGOs and for teaching in the university. They're not in the Woredas. In the Woreda, the district is the main point where people and government meet. So these people have to be employed there. They are trained in development management, in public policy and public administration. These people know what the Woreda administration should do. The administrator could be political. He could be appointed, he could be assigned, or she could be elected. But you need the professionals there who can bring in all the resources into sustainable economic development, especially when it comes to agriculture. Today we are importing edible oil, but we export oil seeds. Today we are importing sugar. 11 sugar factories were planned. All of them were wasted to corruption. We're even going to export. We're importing wheat. Do you know the lowland wheat research has been done by the Institute of Agricultural Research, which is its former name that I know when I was working in government, has done this research probably 50 years ago under Emperor Haile Selassie. Now there is a good trial going on, and frankly, this is very good. If we have lowland wheat, much of our lowlands, like Somali region, Afar, can be very productive areas, not only to feed Ethiopia, but the entire region around us. So, but public administration is the most important thing in terms of developing our agricultural potential, our agro-industrial potential, and also the kind of financial management reviews that we need. I'm not saying we should open up the financial sector today, but there is no debate leading to that conclusion. And we cannot live alone in a globalized world where trillions of dollars are transmitted every second on the internet. Today we cannot say we're just closed bound by ourselves. So these are my major recommendations.
Thank you so much. Very interesting ideas. I think we should end it there. Probably we'll discuss about privatization and the sugar corporation, the banking sector, the finance sector, hopefully in another edition. This is the end of the show for today. Thank you both for your contribution, Dr. Constantinos Berhe Tesfa, Policy Advisor, and Getachew Mariam, Investment Consultant. Next time, we'll come back with another topic and another guests. Until then, goodbye from me, Begna Simesso, and the team at Addis Matters.